Welcome back to the Bonsai Builders Podcast. I'm your host, Addison Galambos. My guest today is Hugh Grant, checking back in from the illustrious Tree Makers Studios in Australia. Hugh has been on a previous episode and we had a lot of fun, so we wanted to run it back when I heard that he's currently obsessing over something that is very near and dear to my heart, and I think all of yours, and that is how to best teach bonsai. So he's in the process of building a custom curriculum for a new series of intensive courses or training courses out of his studio in Australia. You know, the challenge of teaching bonsai is maybe not a new one, right? So there's things to lean on, but the challenge of teaching bonsai in the Southern Hemisphere and with species in the Southern Hemisphere is a little bit of added complexity. So we're going to talk about him kind of structuring his training courses and how he's going about that and what he's optimizing for. And then also how he's translating the kind of seasonal timings between the Northern and Southern Hemisphere. So Hugh, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks, Addison. Really appreciate having me on again. Very exciting to be here. Yeah.
So I've seen some rumblings online. You know, I've been seeing your FAB, I think, Fundamentals of Australian Bonsai course. Yeah. I don't know if that's the new one you're developing, but would love to hear a little bit about like where you're at with your kind of instruction creation and the curriculum and what's top of mind for you.
Yeah. So, it was fun that the course name I created had a little acronym, which was good. It's always good to have acronyms. So I thought FAB was pretty fun, so it's going to be a fabulous class. Yeah, so it's I've had like kind of a long journey trying to figure out how on earth I want to teach bonsai. I've ruminated on it for a long time. And it's not that I don't continuously teach bonsai. I have lots of long-term private students I work with. Over the last sort of 5 years since the pandemic, I've played around with different structures and different ways of doing things. But originally when I started teaching, when I started Tree Makers, which was about 2018, 2019, it's weird. I was looking at my ABN, which is Australian business number. It's like when you register a business. I was like looking at some details on it recently, and I registered in 2019. I've always said people 2017, but I think I must have just been like saying I had a business, but it didn't officially, you know what I mean? I was so sure it was 17, but no, it was 19. But in 19, me and my ex-partner at the time, we rented a property, and I finally had this capacity to like do the bonsai garden thing, even though it was a rental. And we had this nice big flat backyard with a shed on it. And it was like the perfect small size bonsai garden to sort of pseudo set up this maquette of something that I'd want to do in the future. And coming back from Mariah only like 2 years before, and, obviously intimately following Ryan's work and keeping up to date with him, I was really interested in literally just copying his format of 3-year programs that you visited 3 days at a time, 3 times a year, broken up into sort of genres of plants. So I did a broadleaf and an elongating species stream. And I think I had 3 different classes. I think it was 2 broadleaf and 1 elongating, or the other way around. I can't remember. But I just sort of kicked that off and just saw what would happen. And turns out there were a lot of people watching what I was doing, and I filled them all up immediately, which was really exciting. They're reasonably affordable at that time and for what I needed to earn. And, so it was a good take up of it, and it was really fun. And I got to experiment with this way of like teaching long format ways of teaching bonsai. So that ran for a year. Into the second year, then the pandemic happened. I had to shut it down. At the same time as the pandemic sort of started in Australia, all the lockdowns, me and my ex at the time, we decided to move to the Blue Mountains. And that's when I made the shift up here where I am now. It was an easy move because we had, there was no one on the road, and you could get permits to like move house. It was like one of the things you're allowed to do. So we spent like a month moving house. And then, like months went by, we were able to get things off and running again. And I basically restarted the second year program. I think I skipped over a few classes or started it in 21. I can't quite remember, but one of the classes dropped off. The people just couldn't dedicate to it anymore with changing times. So 2 of the classes kept running. One of them kind of fizzled out into more like private study with who are now some of my most dedicated students who study with me monthly to this day. And then the other one went in and basically finished. So it was a bit of a roller coaster, the first version of that program. And I was a bit like sort of, I think due to the world and everything, and like people were stressed about money and finances and dedicating to long form programs. I tried to re-offer it again, but there wasn't that much interest, and I sort of backed down. And since then I've had this like kind of tumultuous trying to figure out how I want to teach bonsai. And I sort of leaned into trying to facilitate towards every single person I possibly could, which I think is a wise choice because Australia proportionately is quite a small population based on the landmass. Same landmass basically as not North America, but the United States, minus Alaska. But we have as many people who live in the greater LA region. So, so very, very different dynamics. And so I felt like I need to capture everyone I can. And I went through these programs of doing like really short form teaching programs where people come to short form workshops. I did lots of different each year, different versions of that. And they were great. Like it's not that they were bad or wrong or not taken up. People took them up. But for me, what I kept coming back to is I never felt comfortable with that teaching style because I know from my learning of bonsai is a very in-depth practice. And I'm very interested in teaching people who want to go as deep as I want to go, ultimately. So, slightly selfish, but, you can only teach what you want to teach in the way you want to teach. That's what individualizes different teachers. So I finally, this year, or almost last year, I kind of had this new idea, which was basically a refurbishment of the original intensive program. So it started last year. I did a one-off 2-day rock and stone planting intensive, just to see like what the interest was in doing something a little bit more long form, and was taken up immediately. I had people from all over the country come to it. It was a lot of fun, and I just went, this is the way I want to do it. And so then that was July last year. So I went through this almost like 9-month period of being like, that's what I want to do, but I also feel like I'm not sure, like, is it the way I want to do things? Is the way people want to do things? And then eventually in the first quarter of this year, I was like, no, that's what I'm going to do. Wrote out a brief, set it up. And then, I kind of procrastinated and felt like, like maybe I've left it too late because now there's not enough time for people to dedicate a whole year to a program to set up their life, and then I sort of just like, funnily enough, I had a chat with Ryan. And Ryan sort of said, get your finger out of your ass and just go for it. And Ryan's always been a mentor to me. So I took that very strongly and I went, all right. So I put it out there and, I put it out maybe a month and a bit ago from the time of this recording, and we've only got one position left to fill. So I was ecstatic at the take up and seeing how many people were interested in it. And it sort of highlighted to me that when you present an educational program that is very definitive in its goals, I think people are attracted to that level of clarity in what the offering is. And the people who are attracted to what I want to offer are the people that will come. So it self manages itself, right? Obviously, it's limited. People need the time. They need the resources to attend what these courses are, which are same program 3 times a year that you lock into. You attend 3 classes. But this time I ramped it up and they're 4 days long. I feel like 3 to 4 days is the perfect amount of time to be able to, they'll just backtrack. The 2-day one I did was great. But I felt like when we got to the end of the day 2, the students were like ready to keep going. You know what I mean? Like it was like it began, we got settled in, we did some fun stuff, and then everyone left, So the previous ones I did in 2019 were 3 days, and I felt like that was great. But I felt like personally for me, I was like, I really want to push people to get to that point where they come, they get introduced for the day, we settle into some work on the second day. The third day, we're sort of continuing or ramping it up into some more projects. And the fourth day gives us time to kind of like slowly slow down rather than it being this abrupt end, which is what I found in the 3-day programs was sort of the very last day. Everyone was kind of like staying back really late, trying to finish things. And it was a bit rushed, you could say. So I feel like this gives us a nice climb up the mountain and then a nice descent being 4 days. So,
I like that. So, one thing I wanted to interrupt you there. So it sounds like you're optimizing your class structure for a very specific, you know, persona, right? You
Mm.
want these kind of intermediate to advanced hobbyists, or like people who want to go deep in bonsai like you do. And, I think I've been talking a lot about that kind of idea with folks where it's like, hey, with bonsai, there's this, the majority of people, like the majority from a monetary perspective or from like just a raw humanity perspective, are beginners, right? And so
Yes.
there's these kind of casually into bonsai people, but I think it takes a lot of courage, and then also like serves a very specific market that needs to be served whenever we're making things for people who want to like jump in with both feet into bonsai. So can you go a little bit more into like your decision-making process on, like you said, 3 times a year coming out to visit it, like that's a big commitment, and maybe not
It is.
somebody who's like has a Malzai at home is going to do,
Yeah.
right? So how did you think about that? Or like, were you a little bit worried about like, yeah, am I going to get enough people, or how did that go through your mind?
I was very worried I always like to be, I sometimes get advice from people around, when you run a business, you've got to kind of create a sense of something, right? But I ultimately like to lean on being honest and just be a human. And to be honest, I was very nervous. Like I was racking my brain. Like I released the courses and I had this emotional dump because I was like, all right, I felt very vulnerable. I was putting myself out there and I was like, if it fails, I know it's going to hurt me. I would pick myself back up, I'd pivot again. But yeah, no, I was super nervous, but then was pleasantly greeted with lots of enthusiasm, which is great. I want to sort of backtrack to what you said, intermediate or advanced practitioners. Interestingly, and I predicted this, was that, and the way I describe the course, if you go on the website and read the outline, I sort of tried to really pontificate and be personal around the advertising, the offering, tell the story that I just sort of told you, and speak about what kind of people I want to see there. And one thing I highlighted is that I don't want the courses to be distinguished by skill level. I want someone in the room who has never touched a bonsai, who is introducing themselves, basically do an introductory course. And I want everyone in between, all the way up to someone maybe who has practiced bonsai for 50 years and they want to, let's say, are interested in learning my style of doing bonsai. Because every teacher is personal, right? That's inevitable. So I really highlighted that. And in the people who have taken it up, when I look at the people who have signed up, I have one guy who is a fresh beginner. Like he's been doing bonsai 3 months, probably 4 months now to this day, right? And he is really dedicated and said that this is exactly what he was looking for, right? And then I have people who have been practicing a long time and they are just interested in following my curriculum. And I have students who have done the program in the past who want to redo it in this new format because they want to take on the information again and basically study, come to the gym and use the gym equipment once again and retrain their skills and be immersed in that program. So I sort of have everyone coming, which is cool, from all walks of life, all walks of skill level. And that's exactly what I wanted, because I think it's very important with bonsai education in this format to not distinguish skill level, but to distinguish dedication to practicing bonsai in the time frame that truly allows you to do it properly, which is, it's not often you sit down with a tree and you learn a task in like an hour. It's usually over multiple reiterations, maybe larger scale projects being challenged, doing different things over a couple of days to really hone in techniques and seasonal timings and different types of trees. So yeah, skill level is not something I want to distinguish by. It's more I want to distinguish by who wants to be there to try and learn bonsai in its truest sense, you could say, right?
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, so you could almost think of like intermediate and advanced, not in terms of skill, but in terms of commitment to bonsai, right? Yeah, like somebody who's ready to put in the work. So the problem though, or the challenge I see with lots of different skill levels in the class is that it makes it more difficult for you as the teacher. I mean, you've got experience under your belt in teaching now, right? So it's something you can handle, but are you going to kind of shift people throughout classes, for example, to like group by skill level to some extent? Or how do you think of the challenge of like, do you think that all the things that you're teaching will be applicable to everyone in the class, regardless of skill level? Or how do you think of that challenge?
Yeah. So the information, so the classes will have, they're broken up into lectures, tutorials, involved demonstrations, you could call it. And obviously, us having a good time workshopping on trees, whether it's in groups or individually, right? So there's enough time to do all of that, which is what's really important about the 4 days. But the way I'll break that up, and I enjoy this process, is the information, right? So the theory is applicable to any skill level, right? Because I'm sharing both my ethos, I'm sharing basic technique, which that's a really important one, is the fundamental basic skills that allow you to practice bonsai. I want the program to allow people in this first year to sort of almost be inducted into the way I teach basic skills, which comes from my own model. It's a bit of the Mariah model, which is then obviously a bit of the Kimura and the Hamano model, so it's like this lineage. So the basic skills are embedded naturally within the program because that is allowing people to be inducted. Induction is kind of the way I like to think about it. Because they're seasonal classes, spring will be repotting, summer will be growth management, and autumn will be design, right? So nice fluid breakdown. That applies to all species across the board and all stages of development in a way. So the theory is across the board. And then the practical, right? The practical working on trees, the way I'll distinguish skill level is I'll identify someone's skill set. Usually probably we'll do this via doing a group project to start off with. So I can sort of identify people's skill sets. And by doing that, I can then further in more individual projects on trees, I can then facilitate, okay, I can see your strengths are here. I can see your weaknesses there. I can see you're a beginner, but some reason you have this natural innate talent. Or I can see that you're nervous. I can see that you're, say, a medium level practitioner and you feel challenged by this. So I'll give you this to sort of ramp you up to that. So I'll be able to allocate very quickly based on that. And I have a lot of experience doing that. It's not new to me to do that with people. But I like that in the room, there would be multiple skill levels being challenged in multiple ways, which creates a really nice dynamic sort of workshop style setting where each student can sort of glean from each other and support each other. And that's kind of the way I want to see it. I want to see it as like a little cohort of people. And the classes are small, 4 people, so we'll be able to be quite intimate in that. And, really advanced people. Like I have one student who's very good, who has done a lot of programs with me, including the original intensive program. And he's naturally really, really good at bonsai. So I'm going to kind of lean on him in a way to be like almost like a not superior to the other students, but have a skill set that I can kind of be like, hey, can you assist this person? Because I know that I trust you to be able to assist them. So maybe they would do a duo project where he is almost like teaching in a sense, which I think is great when someone's really good. What's the next way to challenge them? It's for them to regurgitate the information and to be a mentor themselves.
Absolutely. And they can't do that. That helps solidify their understanding. Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree.
So having a mixture of people in the room, it really, I think it nourishes the learning opportunities for everyone.
I love that. I also saw that in the blurb on the course that people can bring their own material, but the expectation is that they bring that tree back for future sessions.
Yeah. So
that seems like a very targeted thing. So can you talk to me about that a bit?
Yeah. So the first year will be, like I said, it's an induction. So students will only be working on trees here. And that's primarily so that I can really have a lot of control over the objectives. Because one thing I've found, and I know you've spoken about this on your podcast before, is working on bring your own tree to a learning opportunity or working on trees in the teacher's garden. Those two worlds, I think they're two very different, powerful ways of learning. But learning and working on trees in someone else's garden, what it does is it really focuses the learning outcomes on the skills, and the skills almost only, right? Less so than the romanticized love for your own tree, which I think I've identified even in myself, right, can sometimes muddy the waters of how much you can learn out of a session. purely because, you have these preconceived notions. You're maybe really rambunctious or really nervous because it is your own piece that you've fallen in love with, right? So the first year, I want people to sort of remove that from the equation and let's just focus on skills. And I can literally allocate exactly how I want them to learn, what I think they could learn, give them material that will, challenge them slightly or a lot, depending on where they're at, but have a lot of control over that process. And then, in the following years of the program, I've already had a few other ideas since putting out a rough brief of what year 2 and 3 will do. I'll probably adjust that. But yes, it will involve students being able to potentially, if they want, bring their own projects, but still be under consult with me so that learning outcome still keeps going. And I do have ideas for where students would graduating to a similar program, but being a lot more fluid and dynamic and let's say self-prescribed by the student, which would then involve more of their own projects if they so wish. So,
yeah, I love that. And it's so true that the more variables that you can control, the more effective you are at the curriculum that you're trying to, to impart, right? The induction that you're trying to do. So I think that stability makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So,
I think about this. Sorry, just a point on that. I always think about how our other creative practices taught and learnt. And you can easily put yourself, a lot of us have been to a beginner's painting workshop or a beginner's ceramic workshop, a welding workshop. And, I was looking at different programs offered from different studios in Sydney and places like that. And what I noticed was similar thing, when it's a induction style, hey, we're initiating you into the practice, whether you're experienced or not, it's not like you go to a welding workshop and you bring your own welder and you bring your own metal and you bring you go there, you learn a skill, everything's provided, and you get to focus on the skill, right? Only. And so then it gives the student the ability to go home and practice, but it gives them the ability to come in and know the system, really, really generate the skills exactly, right? There's no muddying of their own material there to throw the teacher off and have them have to also work with their materials, which maybe don't suit the actual project at hand and then disappoint the student, you know what I mean? So it's not an unusual way of learning. Bonsai is unique in that we have this relationship with the materials that we work with. And so I think what I've noticed, particularly in Australia, there's not many learning opportunities in Australia where you don't bring your own tree. And I've gleaned a lot from the American audience because I've noticed at conventions in America, I'll see there's a workshop, right? And then there's a BYO workshop. And I think that's a really great way to distinguish it. I've never seen that in Australia where you go to a convention workshop and there's 8 junipers provided and it's a juniper workshop with artist, John Smith. And here's the materials you're going to learn. He knows how to work on junipers really well. He's going to guide you through the process and it's more about the skill and not about the material. Maybe you get to keep the material, maybe you don't, maybe you buy it. But the point is you're learning a very dedicated skill set or a dedicated topic, right? As soon as you BYO in your own tree, all of a sudden now the whole world is open to every possibility. And that's actually not conducive to learning rapidly or effectively, I don't think. Unless that is the dedicated program. Unless the program is, hey, this is about getting advice and mentorship around a project. If that is the process, cool. But if it's not, it should be more dedicated.
Yeah. I love that you're distinguishing a workshop and a course. I think that's a really strong distinction. And I don't think we make here saying workshop is hey, I'm going to bring in my tree and we're going to work on it. And a course being here's these dedicated outcomes that I want you to get out of this in the process of developing yourself to become a better bonsai artist or, practitioner. So I think that's something we don't talk about a lot. And I think people are really encapsulated by the outcomes on their trees, which, that's a perfectly fine way to pursue the hobby as well, right? But it's different. It's a different thing than learning bonsai to some extent.
Yeah.
I like that. Cool. Very cool. So Jonas had one of my friends on his podcast recently. I think it might have been 2 episodes ago. And they were talking about She went to an intensive, I think, at Andrews and was working at Adams. And she was talking about the power of having material in all stages of development, or like being able to learn about chojubai and then seeing 3 different scenarios for a chojubai at Andrew's place, for example, right? And so I'm curious for you, like, do you feel like you're 100% prepared with like the breadth of material you have to be able to teach the learning outcomes you have, or are you going to have to do some scrambling before classes start? Like, how are you feeling about your inventory against what you want to be able to accomplish for your students?
Yeah. Well, like part of this program too is, and I have been like, I noticed that I have been kind of like preparing for this for about 2 years. I've been kind of hoarding and accumulating material. So knowing that I wanted to do something like this, because my goal with Tree Makers is to be like, it's not a new model. It's kind of an odd new model in Australia, and I've got to always remember that. But it's not a new model worldwide, and that there's a garden that's run by a professional, and they're a professional because they do it full time. That's really the only distinction there. But I use the analogy of being a gym. I want to be like this gym where people can come and train their skills on the best trees that I can possibly source. And I do think in my garden I have some of the most, of certain species, some of the most, interesting best trees that you can find. I dedicate myself towards, I love Ryan's ethos of like, a tree only comes to the garden if I love it, right? And if he has to sell it, which he sells his trees, it's a heartache to sell them, right? So that's also my model, is like, I only have material here that I absolutely love, and if I sold it, I'd be devastated. It's part of the process. But that means that I think then there's a very like distinct quality to the tree. There's a distinct concept around the material here, which creates, if people are interested in what they see, then, it makes it more, let's say, dedicated to what they're coming to learn, which is my process, ethos, skill set, etc. Right? Aesthetic.
Yeah, so they've got examples all throughout the development process that they can kind of dip into to like really target in on the areas that they might not understand, 100%. Or they need more learning on as they go through and
100%,
kind of are inducted.
And my garden now, it's mature enough. I've been working at it with thoughtfulness for 7 or 8 years now in terms of the trees I bring in. And I've held a lot of trees to refinement. So, for example, Kunzia ambigua, which is a species I'm known for quite heavily, I think I was the first one collecting them pretty abundantly. They were collected in the past, but, I was pretty hard on them for a long time, collecting them. And, I have Kunzias that people can come and work on that are uber refined to the point where they need to transition to the next iteration. I have trees that are entering refinement. I have trees that are midway through being built, and I have raw material on hand in boxes, right? So like on a lot of species, and that's probably one of the major ones, but I have all of these trees that people can drop into and practice and get an experience on. But also then I can go, hey, let's go look at a really refined one so that we can understand how we're going to style this raw one. Or here's a really refined one that you're going to do refinement work on. And here's probably what it looked like when it started, right? So there's this full breadth that I can show people, and they can drop into different experiences very easily. The beauty of that too is, running a professional garden, unless you have like 10 staff on hand, it's almost impossible, right? That's why the Japanese model is so enticing to people to go study, because, there's apprentices behind those teachers or those professionals, and work's getting done. So part of this model too is I want people to be involved in building tree makers. I want them to have a say in what the trees look like and how they develop, because I can't do it all on my own. So I want students to be involved in that, which helps the garden to grow, helps them to be involved in that. And so Tree Makers will become a community build project, facilitating my progress, career-wise, absolutely, they are assisting in that. But that process is the reason I'm doing this, is so that I have the abundance so that people can come and learn here and learn on trees at all different levels. And, of material that's unique to our location in the world as well. This model it's like an adapted version of how people can drop into, let's say, the Japanese apprenticeship model of context. but within a Western, let's say, allowed time dedication to how they could study, So you could say it's like 4-day apprenticeships, continuously over the season.
Yep, makes sense. I like that. I like that concept. Are there other pieces of how you've designed the course that you want to call out that were very intentional? Like I love the kind of, I think the 4-person class size is a like 4 to 6 is a really good class size. I'm curious how you arrived at that, or like what your experience has been. But then, we've talked about a few, but just wanted to give you a chance to talk about any other like really intentional or you think important functions of the course.
Yeah. For people, it's kind of self-governed or like forced on me, because my workshop can really only fit 4 people. So that's a big part of that. Like you say, 4 to 6, I think, is a nice number. Once I get to 6 people, personally, I start to feel challenged. I'm up for the challenge of 6 people in the room, and I could do that. I wouldn't go more than 6 ever, though. 6 is really like my max point. I think you don't have too much dilution of people in the room then. Even over 4 days, the course could be 10 weeks long. I think still 6 people is like the max. 4 is a good minimum because it creates like 2 partners when there's group projects. There's enough people in the room for it to be kind of dynamic, with me being the 5th. But yeah, my workshop really only holds 4. Once I'm in there working as well, 5 people, it's pretty tight. So we can deal with that. So that's really why I capped it at 4. When one day I have the capacity to have a bigger workshop, build something dedicated rather than just utilizing recycling what we inherited on the property we bought, I will definitely probably open it up to 6. But for now, 4 is really a forced hand, you could say. But I like that, I like that it's 4. 4 is nice. It means over time, as I get better with this program, because I really like it. I hope that it perpetuates, inevitably forever. I'd love it to be sustainable like that. As I have the capacity, I'll have the capacity to be able to facilitate 6 people, I think. And that's where I'd probably end it at. Yeah. Yeah. But in terms of accumulating material, even with, I probably have 300 trees being developed on site of significant level. I've also added into I'm ramping up a bit of a material production side of the garden too, like growing things from the ground up. So this is not including that. But yeah, probably 300 specimen trees of all different, whether it's raw Yamadori in boxes or mature nursery stock, all the way up to refined trees. Even with that many trees, I noticed some holes. So the last 2 weeks since I've had significant, filling of the sign up positions, I've been hustling to find a few more trees just so that I don't get short. I'd rather have too many than too little, So I've had a friend of mine was selling some really significant trees, which I had actually sold him as raw material in the past. So it was just serendipitous that he was selling a few of them. So I went and hoovered them all up. But over the last sort of year or two, I've been sort of buying a lot more than I sell, if you could put it like that, right? Every time I've got a new batch of raw material from a collector, I've kind of kept most of them, where in the past I would sell 2/3 to 90% of them and keep the cream. Yeah, lately I've been a bit more selfish and just, no, they're not for sale. Knowing that I would need more material than I could handle for, anticipating releasing a program like this, which actually I really like because, I buy trees because I love them, not because I want to get rid of them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think that's really smart. And I think it's something that people don't always think of, but yeah, to have a professional garden and have it be a place where people can learn across skill levels, you just have to have that variety, right? You have to have the numbers.
Yeah.
And it's not always like every tree in your garden is just the top 1 specimen. You need some variety in there to meet people at their different skill levels, and to, maybe somebody works on that specimen, and then there's somebody else needs a different set of work, right? So I love that. I love that. Cool. So, the other thing that you mentioned that I thought was interesting was you said you kind of researched how some other courses had been run. Obviously you took your own experience from Mirai and other intensives you've taken and then you also took kind of research from looking at pottery classes and other things in Australia. Any other maybe the answer is no, but any other comments on that process of like tidbits that you were able to steal from unrelated disciplines? I just thought it was interesting that you looked at, pottery and painting and stuff like that as
Yeah.
well.
Nothing's coming to the top of mind straight away, but I guess just to talk around that point more, I think, I know myself, but bonsai is quite a myopic world. And I think it's important to look around and think about how other pursuits within the same bracket of the world, creative pursuits, horticultural pursuits, craft pursuits, even artistic pursuits, I think it's important to look at those places and say, hey, like, why is there success? Why is there a lot of adoption of those crafts more so than bonsai? Because bonsai has a pretty high drop-off rate, I think, because it is a pretty dedicated practice. I think there's a certain type of person who locks into it. So I think by me sort of looking outwards and thinking, and I've always been sort of close to the art world. I went to university and studied fine art, and the learning process of creative pursuits is familiar to me. And I've always wondered why bonsai is quite extra niche in that people don't take it up as much as would hope. And I think part of it is the tree is a big dedication, the ownership of it. So I'm really interested in seeing people develop their skills before they develop their collector's mindset, you could say, or do that together, in a way that facilitates the process. Something that comes to mind is I have a student, I'll say her name because I can call her out, Vivian Lai. She's a great example for me. She's about my age. She attended one of the first intensives I did in 2019. And to this day, she does sort of private long form study with me. But she doesn't own any trees, never has, doesn't want to, but she loves practicing bonsai, right? And she's a very thoughtful person in that, she plans and strategizes. And she's like, you know what? I feel like once I reach my 40s or 50s, I'll probably reach a point in my career and lifestyle where I'll have more time and I'll want more time to do more creative things outside of work. Maybe then I'll start a bonsai collection, right? But for now, I want to get really, really good at bonsai. So when I do start a collection, it's just this really seamless, fluid thing, right? The skills aren't questionable, right? And I really look up to her and it's not for everyone. That's not necessarily the way to practice bonsai at all, but she's a great example of the far end of the spectrum of in that, she's just learning skills and having experiences, and she's doing that through my garden and just her thoughtfulness around hey, skills are my priority for the next few decades versus tree ownership and being bogged down there like that. She travels, she's away months and months and months of the year. So it's not conducive to her lifestyle, but bonsai can still be a part of her interest in life. And I think that is a great example of where I think programs like this or gardens like mine can facilitate people to practice bonsai in every way possible, and the tree not be the thing that bogs you down from maybe not taking it up. Because if she felt like she had to own trees to learn bonsai, she's not doing bonsai. She wouldn't be doing it. She'd move on to another hobby, right? And so that's just a really great example, I think, of how do we get more people practicing? I think it's, hey, experiences, learning, being able to develop skills. She has trees in the garden that I will put her on every time she comes here. So she almost does own them in a sense. She owns the designs. She has ownership over the development. But the ownership of her own, in her own garden is not a part of the equation. And so, yeah, it's a really, really beautiful process. But she's a good example of what I'm trying to speak to there, I think.
Oh man, so cool. That's giving me chills almost, that thought. So it's really funny that you mentioned that, because next week I'm talking to, I think you said her name was Vivian, my own Vivian in the local area, who is learning at people's gardens but doesn't have any trees of their own.
Oh, the Vivians, hey?
So I'm very curious. Yeah. So it's I know, right? They're just out there. Funny. So I'm I don't want to spoil too much, but I'm very excited to jump into that topic. And what you said has given me a lot to think about for prepping for that. But I think that's such an interesting thought that absolutely the lifestyle of having this committed thing that kind of bogs you down detracts from the people who can do the hobby. But when you really look at it, if you focus on your skills first, like at some point in your life, probably you're going to slow down a little bit and you're going to be more settled and stable, right? Maybe not for everyone, but most people, that's kind of how their life goes, right?
Yeah.
And so if you, like for me at least, before I built the skills, I had trees, but I don't, like none of those trees are the caliber of tree that I want in my ultimate garden anyways, right? So I've cycled through those and like sold those and bought better material as my skills have improved, right? So really I could have the garden that I have today if I started 4 years ago, even though I started 8 years ago, right? So the gap there was like my own skill and like my ability to assess material, and like chances are that that tree that you buy in year one is not going to be like I mean, it depends on what your goal is for your garden, right? But realistically, like if you have the skills, which you can build separately from having a garden, like you just mentioned, as long as you have a garden that you can go to work on, even if it's not your own, right? As long as you can get those reps, you can develop those skills that whenever you're able to jump onto the bonsai bandwagon, it can really accelerate you, and you can get to the place that you ultimately want to be if you want to have like a dream garden without having had that dream garden for 30 years, right? So I mean, yes, there's a lot of value in age in trees, and like if you're doing things right and it's older, then it's probably better versus having only worked on it for 5 years or versus working on it for 20 years. But realistically, you can make beautiful trees, or you can just buy trees later on in development and arrive at a similar or same place in less time if you have the skills. So maybe we should see more people jumping on the Vivian bandwagon of learning bonsai, or maybe we should even be encouraging it more and like enabling it more. People to learn bonsai without having bonsai.
Yeah. Especially for young people. I think that's why, I know especially like a lot of clubs in Australia question, why don't we have more young people in bonsai? I think like ultimately to start bonsai young is very conducive to the process, right? Probably the most conducive. Again, material selection can come at any stage. So at any stage in life, you can acquire any stage of material. But younger people probably have a harder time taking it up because, the dedication. So, but, you can learn skills, you can have experiences, you can, have involvement in trees in people's gardens, but remove the ownership, that's the burden that I'm taking on, like I'm a young person in bonsai and
you take the risk
by a garden of trees, but that's, I'm that 1% who was willing and able to do that. And, I would consider myself an artist first before a professional in bonsai, right? In that, it's my job. I've made my creative outlet my job because I want to have time to do my creative outlet, endlessly. So, it's ultimately selfish. I'm not interested in life for working just for the sake of working, right? I want to work, and that sort of like a hunter-gatherer, I want my day to day to be to go hunt down an animal so that I can eat at the end of the day. So it's sort of tapping into that, right? We have a lot of other resources at hand in this world nowadays. So how do I tap into that? Well, I'm interested in spending my day doing bonsai and being creative in that world, and all my surrounding hobbies are to do with bonsai anyway, So I am that person. But how can I offer what I am building to others so that they can have a piece of that in whatever way their lifestyle offers it, right? And I could see people like Vivian, I could see a few of the trees in the garden one day when she says, hey, I want this badass 5-tree collection. Maybe some of these trees she's been working on by then for 20, 30 years here will move to her garden,
Now we've got I'm just thinking of, this is terrible, but I'm thinking of like, whenever you do marketing, you kind of like build out these personas, and now we have like the Vivian card. So
exactly.
maybe that's going to catch on. Sorry, Vivian. No, just kidding.
Turns out Vivian is a real name for this kind of person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So one last tactical thing I wanted to ask you on the course is like, when you're doing an apprenticeship in Japan, or like the Japanese teaching style doesn't involve a lot of theory or like, chalkboard time essentially, right? But that's like a very Western way of learning. So, I personally really enjoy that theory section, and like it aligns well with how I learn. But that isn't traditionally how bonsai is taught in Japan. So I'm just wondering like how you kind of balance that, or like how you thought of like including or not including that theory and
Mm.
balancing it against like actual time working on trees. Like how do you think of that?
Yeah, I think I have an outline of like basics that I want to teach super theoretical in the classes. A lot of that's inducting people into the process. It's like, hey, like, we're going to repot over the next 4 days. Let's theoretically go through the process of repotting, the horticulture of why, the whys of why we're doing certain tasks, tool introduction, like all of those really mechanical things, and excel rather than spending months watching, your teacher or master, figure out how they're doing things. Like I'll just literally tell you what our process is, and then let's go do it. Let's as soon as possible, let's go do it. And then from that original lecture, the way I will do the theoretical components will be as I see need. I might see 3 people out of 4 maybe struggling with a process that we've just lectured on. Hey, okay, let's all go back to the whiteboard and let's go over this again. Let's maybe look at it from a different avenue. Or, oh, wow, we've all really excelled and we've picked this up immediately, right? Let's go to the next level. Let's maybe get into a bit of philosophy. Let's maybe like think about, oh, okay, we've done all these like, let's say very standard repots, the angle doesn't change much. I can see that all of you guys are up for the challenge. Let's go back to the whiteboard. Let's talk about how we engineer a root system into the pot. Let's go into the theory of that. So outside of the induction style lecture, I will on the fly add more theoretical components in as per need. That's sort of the way I'm going to structure that, right? So it will mean each class will be a bit different, to be honest. But it's
I love that. That sounds
because,
really enticing.
yeah, and I think it makes sense because everyone's different. There'll be I know a few people who are in the courses, so I can almost predict what's going to happen. So I can sort of think about. I know that the first repotting class, the first group, one of the guys in it is very experienced. He's done a lot of learning with me. One of the guys, he's fairly new. He's actually become a really good friend of mine. So we have a real personal relationship, and he's phenomenally good naturally. So that's going to be badass. And then there's another guy. This is the one class I'm yet to fill that one remaining position. So there's 3 in this group. He's just the most enthusiastic guy. He did the stone planting workshop with me. So I've seen him, his repotting skills, and he adopted things really quickly. So I can predict that first class is probably going to be, let's get down to basics. Day 1, let's do some basic stuff. Day 2, I've already planned what we'll repot. I think day 2 we'll do something super high level. This really interesting bit of new Yamadori I got in the garden that needs transitioning. So we'll probably do that as a group. And I can imagine day 3 or 4, I reckon we'll be diving into some real philosophical lectures and some really high level techniques straight away. I think we'll be doing what I would anticipate people doing in the 3rd or 4th year of projects with me by day 3 of class 1 with that group. So I can already start to think about what will happen based on the people that I see. Yeah. So yeah, it will be super dynamic. And that's kind of the way I want it to be. I want it to be, it's not this rigid class. It is adapting to the students' skill levels, as I said earlier in this talk. I think that's really important so that, it's not about skill level. It's about experiences that facilitate your learning goals and me identifying, hey, like, you're comfortable. Let's challenge you. Let's do something inspiring and challenging.
Love that. So the other thing I wanted to kind of pick your brain on is, this is not something that I've thought a lot about, but I bet you've thought a lot about it, is, most of the classical literature and, trainings out there are geared towards obviously the Northern Hemisphere from a Japanese perspective. So, is it as simple as you just like change June to December in everything and then you're good? Or like that's how I'm imagining it. So please burst my bubble and tell me like how you adapt these kind of, obviously you have the experience of doing bonsai in Australia for a long time now, but how do you adapt these kind of practices and resources to your own course in your own hemisphere?
It's such a good question. And I think it's a question on a lot of people's minds when they realize that the northern and southern hemisphere are opposites. It's a surprising amount of people I speak to and I say that and they go, oh yeah, I never thought about that. But that makes, like, they know it, but they haven't thought about it in the real world and how that actually affects you. And in Australia, we are a lot more aware of that, I think, because, like I said, a lot of knowledge comes from the northern hemisphere. That's online, that's in books, and that's just proportional populations once again. Most of the bonsai practicing population is in the northern hemisphere to date. I might be wrong on that. There might be a lot of secret people practicing in South America and Africa and some of the Pacific Islands for sure. That's probably definitely a thing, but it seems like, at least from an output perspective, there's less here than there is up there. But look, I'd say 80% of the time, yes, June is December, right? I think it is as simple as that, right? Because it literally is just a flip on its head, right? So the summer solstice, is the end of December here. For you guys, it's the end of June. Trees are photosynthetic, photoperiod reactive organisms, so they follow the light. So yeah, it is as simple as flipping it on its head. Where I guess it gets more nuanced, and this applies throughout the northern hemisphere, is timings will change based on your latitude and your geographical location. So in the southern hemisphere, when we're looking to the northern hemisphere for information, one piece of the puzzle I think a lot of people miss is that if you're looking at an artist practicing in Sweden versus in southern Spain, the timing does have to be adjusted, right? Because they are very different climates. Everything zeroes out on the solstices. So, candle pruning black pines, at latest, you're going to be doing it around the summer solstice, right? If not just slightly in, right? Which would be January for us, which would be July for you guys. So, but everything zeroes in, winter solstice, the season technically for a tree begins, the storage of resources has, finalized, and those resources are being utilized in the tree system, right? So it's about how technique changes based on your climate, how close you might do something. So for instance, I live in a really kind of weird, difficult location to disseminate information because I'm at latitude 32. Sydney is just down the hill from us. I'm at 1,000 meters elevation. So I have a climate that is very similar to, say, like southern Tasmania in terms of when things start to grow, when technique can be applied, maybe a little bit warmer than them because not warmer, sorry, but a little bit shift in time even to southern Tasmania because although I'm in this cooler location at a latitude that is warmer, the daylight length doesn't change on elevation, right? So there's multiple inputs into how you would adjust your timing. So for instance, temperature-wise, I can track my temperatures throughout the season to be almost the same as like Hobart in southern Tasmania. But they're, 11 degrees difference further south. So although the temperatures are the same, the timing still is maybe bumped around by 2 to 4 weeks. But then my timing between Sydney, which is, there's certain points on some of the hills here, you can see the city. You can see the glow of it down the mountain. Down there, they're 2 to 4, sometimes 6 weeks different in timing. Again, even though we're on the same latitude, right? So I live in this island of difference. So a lot of my students come from Sydney and they'll bring a maple in mid-August to be repotted because I've recommended, bring it in August to be repotted because by mid to late September, that's when they start to grow here. But they started growing in mid-July, So the timing can be like incredibly different. So that's a challenge because I'm sort of in the first half of the season, winter to summer. I am behind Sydney. And then from summer to winter, I'm ahead of Sydney in terms of that ramp down. So there's a lot of adjustment I have to make there, which is interesting. But yeah, looking at the northern versus southern hemisphere from a timing perspective, if you take into account the information you're digesting in the north and their latitude, compare it to your own, and then flip it on its head, it's simple as that, a lot of the time.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the challenge you talked about with time shifts, like for you versus somebody, a few, like an hour south of you.
Yeah.
different elevation. I think, Ryan obviously talks a lot about that in terms of like teaching physiological indicators as opposed to strict timings, right?
Yes,
And
yes,
that's
that's super
obviously,
important. Concept over like,
yeah,
hey, you do this on this day. Rather, let's talk about
yep,
what the indicators are and the bracket
yep,
of
yeah,
timing
yeah,
in which that indicator can be seen and then responded to.
yep, totally. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about was, I think the other thing that's pretty unique is you're going to be, or like, how much of a focus is there specifically on Australian trees for
Mm,
your courses and for your curriculum? Like,
yeah.
have you had to kind of invent the wheel to some extent for some of these species? And are you like kind of unveiling that or focusing on that through this course? How are you tracking that?
Yeah. That's a question I think on every Australian's mind, and probably from afar too. Like, what are these Australian trees? And it's sort of like the last answer to the question. 80% of the time, it's like the same timing. Plants only have a few procedures that they apply, right? And the timing is still the same. Spring is your most abundant growth time, biggest push. You know, the second half of the season is allocation of resources and lighter flushes of growth, unless it's something that's really rambunctious. There's Once you delve into the nuances of a species in particular, that's where things break down, no matter where in the world you're practicing with your local plants. But I guess the teaser of the program is, I called it the Fundamentals of Australian Bonsai, which some people may interpret as, we're only going to work on Australian trees, right? The way I've sort of cunningly named that is, it's more about how do we practice bonsai in the context of Australia, which naturally will mean that we'll be practicing in lots of Australian trees, because where are we? We're in Australia, right? So I'm not specifically teaching on any given species. I'm not teaching on any given geographical location, political location of tree. It's more really like, what do I have in my garden? And I have my ethos and interest is in working on trees that I'm interested in, right? And that naturally, I work on a lot of Australian local plants, a lot of Southeast Australian local species. So that would just naturally be a part of the program. I'm also really interested in working on very commonly used, unique Australian trees, right? So we have, for instance, I have a lot of English elm in my garden. I have a increasing number of European olive in my garden. I have a lot of deciduous trees in my garden of, your Japanese types like trident maples, but also liquid ambers, the English elm, like I spoke about before. Junipers. I love junipers. They're one of my favorite trees of all time. I think a lot of people understand why. They're a classic for a reason. But yeah, they're fantastic. I broke myself on junipers early on when I practiced bonsai as a teen, So yeah, like species that I've identified that I'm interested in that are unique, like the English elm in Australia. A lot of people don't know this. Even in Australia is, I think, quite a unique product of material that we have. We have a lot of English elm that were planted out in, basically replacing trees in cow paddocks in the southeast where it's quite cold. And there's a collector I work with who collects some phenomenal cow tune English elms. And, I might be biased, but they're some of the best English elms I've seen worldwide. I haven't seen all of them, right? I can only see what I've seen on the internet, but they're fantastic bits of material. So to me, although it's not a geographic, political Australian tree, the aesthetic that is, the species is tapped into Australian history in that it was a tree used for shade on these sort of cow ranches and things like that. But that the material has been carved out by the ecosystem and sort of like a Western influence on the ecosystem, to me is like a part of the Australian story. So these English elms, I'm enamored by them because they are so unique. They are so phenomenal in the character that they have. And to me, they're Australian, right? They're just this new 200-year version of Australia. So that's kind of the part of the naming, Fundamentals of Australian Bonsai. It's like, contextually, let's talk about bonsai in this context and how it applies to technique and aesthetic, which will naturally incorporate Australian trees, which I think is the real unique selling point. But it will also disseminate information around species that we use that aren't naturally Australian, but highlight as well with that comparison how similar they are, right? Because technique doesn't change that much, right? Across Australian trees to Northern Hemisphere trees, trees are trees, right? Where the difference is maybe in the aesthetic output, right? So what is the growth habit? What is the representation at old age, in antiquity, that allows us to create an aesthetic? But from a technical point of view, the really Australian trees, European trees, American trees, Japanese trees, what 80% the same, I would say. This is a very round number, but there's more similarity than there is difference. And that's something I really want to highlight in the program too, is, hey, let's not get too bogged down in like, is there so much difference? Rather, let's look at the similarities and use that to pivot and dive deeper and learn more, which is what I've done over the last sort of decade. Is something I realized quite a long time ago. I was like, there's been a culture in Australia for a long time of like, we call them natives here, because it makes sense, right? It's a relative term depending on where you are in the world, right? But there's been this culture of like, natives are so different. How do we work on them? I don't understand. Like, and I recognized that I felt like that was a little beside the point, right? Rather, I tapped back into what are the similarities, and then identify the small differences, which are often more aesthetic than they are technical. If you think about a Japanese maple versus a Trident maple, right? Maples, Japanese native trees, techniques are kind of quite different, although they're maples, right? So we have this understanding that within this one location of the world and their native species, that there is quite a lot of difference technically. There's overarching concepts and physiology that are the same, but there's still technical differences in how you produce, phenomenal aesthetic from those two plants. So in Australia, it's the same. If you work on a Nothofagus or a Quinzia ambigua, physiologically, timing of technique, yada, 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 is kind of similar. But what is the actual prune point? What are we trying to get aesthetically out of the plant? What's the natural representation that we're sort of using, which I think in my philosophy is, I'm not trying to make trees look naturally representative. It just happens because growth habit is what guides aesthetic and making it look naturally. I think every tree, no matter what you do to it, if you sort of start to refine a design, whether you put naturally occurring input into it or abstract input into it, the settling and refining of that design will have naturally occurring outputs, because growth habit is really what guides aesthetic at the end of the day, right? A silly example is if you take a weeping species and put the foliage upright, it will try to be a weeping species, and vice versa, right? So that's a growth habit thing. It's not like you saying, hey, like I really want to not have a weeping aesthetic and I'm going to make it look unnatural because it is naturally a weeping tree. It will try and be a weeping tree no matter what you do, no matter how much you bring that structure up. The new growth will always weep, right? So growth habit really is what defines whether a tree is naturally represented or not. And in refinement, that comes out no matter what you do. It just will. Right?
Yeah. I love, first of all, the amount of thought that you put into the name. That was very cool of your course. And then in danger of opening up a can of worms, I've been obsessing a little bit about, so we're talking about natives, right? And I've been obsessing a bit about, I agree that when you look at when I say native, I'm just going to be kind of referring to not even the fact that it grows near you, but more that it doesn't grow in Japan, or like isn't a part of the traditional, there isn't a template for like, okay, this is what a black pine looks like. This is what a Itoigawa juniper looks like, right? There's like almost a weight that comes with that, where it's like, if it's practiced on in Japan, then there's like a very refined version of it that exists out there, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's almost like a fallback to like, this is the correct way to do this to some extent, right? Because, there's this culture that's been practicing it for 600 years and this is what they've arrived at, right? You can debate that, but what I'm really excited about, and I've been obsessing over, like with redwoods, for example, is like, yes, you can apply very similar techniques that like, it's not like it doesn't behave way different than some Japanese species, and you can apply techniques similar to what you would do. You can wire it, you can pinch it, you can prune it. Like there's all these different things that are not like crazy. You would do these same things to a Japanese tree. The thing that I'm excited about though, is that there isn't like here's the one way to here's the one aesthetic that fits, right? Like in the US here, we've got people making these like extremely dense, like pinching back to the first needle pair and making these ultra dense trees. And then we've got these people, doing these reiterative styles where you've got these lots of upright branches. And I'm just so fascinated by like, are we going to converge on like, what is a right way to do redwoods? And I'm very interested in that pursuit in my own practice where I've got this, I live in an area where that tree is very easy to grow and like we have lots of them. And so it's fun to kind of like specialize. And I'm imagining this is similarly to how you feel about some of your Australian natives, where it's like the world's your oyster, where you can even define a new path that looks a little bit different than some of those paths, right? Because there's just more freedom in the fact that it's not something that has the weight of the Japanese culture on it, right?
Yeah.
Just fun.
Yeah. The redwood, I love that you bring up redwood. I have a lot of affection for redwoods. When I was studying with Ryan during my internship, I call it an internship because a lot of people call it an apprenticeship, but I like to call out that I would like to call it an internship because I was only there 3 months. I go back regularly to continue my studies and help Ryan, but it was an internship amount of time. But during that time, Ryan really loaded redwoods onto me. And he did say, I don't know if this was in my head or if he literally said it, but he did say something around the lines of, I think this species will help you in your context. And he was absolutely right. Whether that was incepted into me, that I've then looked out for it to be useful to me or not, but I agree with that sentiment because it has a very robust growth habit that produces multiple flushes of growth a year. If you had to generalize Australian plants, a lot of Australian plants are broadleaf trees. The Southern Hemisphere in general, I think I said this in the last podcast, is a broadleaf evergreen dominated landscape. The Northern Hemisphere seems to be, at least the north of the north, seems to be a conifer and deciduous broadleaf dominated landscape. More entirely conifer as you go further north, a bit more deciduous as you go south, and then you enter the broadleaf evergreen world, like Southern California and all that, Southern Europe. But yeah, Australia, South America, Africa, it's mainly all broadleaf evergreen trees. Let's say 80% once again, to pull out a number out of my ass. And that creates a difference, right? It creates a difference that there's
a suspicious number of 80% out there on this episode.
I know.
So I don't know.
I don't know.
You got to vary the fake statistics up a little bit.
Yeah. It would be funny if someone checks it. No, it's actually 83%. Yeah, whatever. It represents like a vast majority, right? That 80%, 4-to-1 ratio. And it seems to be when I look around the Australian ecosystem, wherever I go, even in conifer-dominated landscapes, like the western side of the Great Dividing Range in Australia, which is a big mountain range that covers most of the east coast. On the western slopes, you'll find calitris, which is it's in the Cypressus family, so related to junipers. It's just the Southern Hemisphere type of juniper. Very different aesthetics and growth habit. They remind me of incense cedars that you see in California. Same sort of reiterative growth habit. They don't grow to be massive trees, but like 5 to 15 meters. But really interesting Italian cypress conical like forms, and when they age, they get these really wonderful wobbly branches like an incense cedar. I love the incense cedars when I went up to the mountains in California a few years ago, because it sort of just struck home with me. I was like, even the giant sequoias look like giant versions of calitris in a way, or calitris look like small versions of sequoias, right? So once again, there's an interesting like growth habits kind of across the world. They reiterate, right? There's only so many ways trees grow. There's just slight nuances that make them special, which are custom built into the foliage, you could say. But yeah, the redwood is, on the calitris on the western slopes of the Dividing Range. There's some landscapes that are dominated by them, whole hillsides that are just coniferous, which is a really interesting, kind of spooky thing to see in Australia because you don't see it very often, where it's just conifer forms and not broadleaf forms. You'll see conifers dominating small pockets of Tasmania. But by and large, even in those locations where conifers dominate, the broadleaf trees are like, they're around, and it's not far that you will go and find a broadleaf dominated landscape once again. So I think it's true that we have broadleaf trees. So that's a big physiological difference and aesthetic difference, but it's not a difference in that it's entirely unique. It's just that when we think about what does Australian bonsai look like, it looks like the broadleaf model. And the broadleaf model looks like a lot more up and open canopies rather than these down, sleek, spruce-like canopies or white pine canopies, right? But the redwood is such a fascinating tree because it does at old age have so many different nuances in the way it grows. Because it grows so much, you can prescribe any kind of embedded structural history into the tree to make it any design that you would like. It'll still have a redwood foliage system, but you could have a cascade redwood, you could have a broom style redwood, you could have a bunjin style redwood, you could have a redwood style redwood, whatever that means, which actually I'm very interested in. 2 times ago, I went to Marai. Ryan gave me a really massive big redwood. That was actually worked on by an Australian student of his who lives in California. So he was like, let's keep the Aussies going on this one. But it was one of the trees he was sort of starting to nail the reiterative form on a, tree must have been 5-6 feet tall. So that was fun. But yeah, there's something about the growth habit, the abundance of it, the freedom of it that has allowed me to sort of like think about Australian trees and open up my context to realize, again, growth habit is embedded in the tree's design, but what you do with the structure dictates how abstract or true to form it maybe is, right? Yeah, so redwoods are cool, and that metabolism that they have is very familiar here. We have a lot of species that will grow, they don't do 1 flush a year, they don't do 2, they do 4 to 8, flushes a year, depending on where you're located. The Kunzia ambigua is a good one. Another generalization is a lot of Metaceae. So that's a group of plants that, again, dominates Australia. It's a family. I think South Africa has a lot too, and South America has a lot of Metaceae as well. I think once again, 70 or 80% of Australia is Metaceae. So that's your eucalypts, your melaleucas, your callistemons, your kunzias, your tea trees, a lot of plants that people know around the world that are Australian. It's Metaceae. And they tend to, not all the time, but a lot of the time, 80% of the time, flower in spring, right? So they're kind of a mid to late spring flowering tree. So their first flush of growth will be dedicated towards housing foliage that will hold the flowers. So it doesn't grow super long. It will house flower buds, it will flower. And then around November, pretty consistently, no matter the climate you're in, around November, peak flower occurs. And sort of like azaleas, once the flowers have reached peak maturity, you go and cut behind the flower, and there'll be 2 buds sitting behind the flower, and then off it goes. And from there, depending on your stage of development, if it's a tree that you're growing branches out on, you'll just leave the flower and let it elongate from the tip if you're running a branch long. But if you're trying to divide growth, you'll cut behind the flower, and then you'll use pruning or pinching to generate more and more growth as it puts out multiple flushes of growth throughout the season. So that's a pretty common strategy with a lot of Metaceae. Differentiates a little bit depending on the species. So like, for instance, tea tree will flower first before they grow. Callistemon melaleuca, Kunzia will put a little bit of growth out and then flower, but technique is the same as to how you handle it. Yeah, so you have these very abundant flushes of growth on a lot of these really strong growing Metaceae species.
Yeah, it's cool to hear how, even though they're different species than what is in Japan, like they're, it's not, I like how you put it that 95% of the kind of process, or 80% of the process, if we're being true to you, might be the same. And then you want to focus on just the small differences, right? And that's kind of where you hone in on it for Australia. But it makes sense. And it's kind of mirrored some of my experience with, the trees that are native here, like shore pine and redwood, and, finding the analogs in the Japanese technique.
I think it's important to look at.
Or the analogs with each other. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's important. I've come to realize that it's important to first focus on similarities rather than differences. And I'll call it out in Australia because it's kind of annoyed me for a long time, is like I said before, there's this culture of like, oh, Australian trees are so different. We have to handle them so differently. And it's true from an aesthetic point of view. Like what's the end silhouette look like? Like what is if you're trying to develop a tree to look true to form, yeah, it does have a really unique aesthetic. But technically, from the basic fundamental techniques, it's pretty much the same. And I think that's where Australian local native bonsai endemic trees, where we've been a bit stalled in our development of them because people have been looking for the differences rather than working with the similarities and then poking at the small differences. And I think it's a much more, and that could apply to anywhere around the world, is if you go back to basic technique, which isn't Japanese, it's just how do you dwarf a tree? Like these techniques allow you to take advantage of growth habit and dwarf it, right? The aesthetic outcome at the end based on growth habit to me is what differentiates aesthetic or makes a plant look unique to another, right? Which naturally is embedded in the tree anyway.
Yeah.
So like in Australia, that's what I want to see more of. I want to see more people like, and my course will do that. Let's focus on fundamentals. We're not going to look at it too differently from species to species, no matter where it comes from in the world. But then the magic is, how do we take that and carve it into something that does represent that species as a mature version of itself, whether it's naturally looking as much as...
How does it capture the imagination of people that grew up in that landscape?
Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to hear, I mean, everything you've talked about your course sounds really exciting. I'm really excited to hear the kind of feedback you get and the adjustments that you make over time. So really curious to kind of check back in on that in the future. This has been a ton of fun. Well, if you're listening to this and that one slot's probably gone by now, but maybe you'll get in the future.
Yeah.
But,
We'll see. Have a look if it's...
Any call outs you want to make for folks?
Yeah, I guess like one small I wanted to add to the course is I don't want it to feel like that's the only way you can come study at Tree Makers. Something I haven't publicly announced yet. It's always been sitting there, but I sort of changed the way I'm offering private study. Private study is kind of like, it is what the student wants it to be, right? But so that people feel like they don't have to do a 4-day program and lock into a whole year of 3 classes to do that, to come study here. I do offer private study, which is on your own terms, on your own schedule. And I have a model in which is like one-on-one. It's where you'd come work with me, entirely with me, one-on-one. You utilize my time and my skill set, and we work together through a project, whether here or yours, or what I've called independent study, which is basically the same amount of dedication you'd get out of a group course or workshop, in that, come work on your trees, come work on trees here in your own time. But it's more like you're doing most of the work. You're really like you would in a workshop. In a workshop, I'm not one-on-one with each student. My time is diluted by 4 if there's 4 people there. So the independent study allows for people to study in a price point and a time point that is based on their process, their time, but still allow them to study here. So I want to sort of throw that in, that, the courses aren't all that we're offering. The private study options are open to everyone and anyone, and is more on your time. The benefit of the courses is the information is disseminated, in time and progressive, and really carves out for the student that dedicated time to come practice and, develop their skills in that sort of more linear way. Yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out there, that is also an option. And if, like I said, this is being recorded from when it's released in the past. So what's today? Today's the 27th of July here in Australia. So whenever this comes out, definitely jump on and go to the website. And if that spot is still available and you're interested, try and jump on it. But if it's not there, it just means it's full now. So yeah. We'll have next year's intake coming out at the beginning of 2027. So there'll be a lot more time for people to jump in on it. And I will put out, once the program has begun, and we have a bit of content to sort of show how the classes are going, I will put out a expression of interest mailing list for people to sign up to so that they can basically get first dibs on the next intake of the program. So you'll have time to think about it for a few months. Then you'll have, 6 to 7 months to also sign up to it physically before it begins in, late winter, early spring of 2027.
You've clearly put a ton of thought into how you're going to impact the community in Australia and globally for bonsai, which I love. I love your focus on teaching, and you can really hear the energy and passion that you put into making sure it's the best experience for everyone, and for helping like perpetuate this kind of community center that you're building right at your own garden. So it's really exciting to hear about. I'm really excited for people to go there and form these cohorts that you've got a lot of bonsai teaching years in you, I feel. So
thanks.
Form these cohorts that help impact the bonsai community. So excited.
I'll throw it out there too. I have a lot of, especially Southern Californian Americans, reach out to me wanting tidbits, advice, some consults, because there is a lot of literal similarity in the native species of Southern California to Australia, Mediterranean climates, right? If any Americans are interested in coming down to Australia for study, there's opportunities there too, so I'll throw it out there as obviously an even bigger dedication of time, huge, but, in case people are like have the time or resources and are thinking about it, I just want to throw it out there that totally open to it, totally possible, whether it's joining these courses or generating a study opportunity for those individuals that's dedicated to their schedule and program. That's totally possible. And I just throw that out there because I have a huge connection to North America, and I know a lot of people, have trees and experiences. I think that they are increasingly wanting to draw from Australia. My wife, Eve, she's from America, and her dad, Jeff, this is embarrassing. Jeff Shahovsky. Never been able to nail that.
It's a mouthful of a name.
It is the old Polish name. But he has a nursery local to him in Santa Barbara or nearby that is an Australian native only nursery. And so he's been playing around with a lot of Australian trees. And so, I know there's a lot of emphasis on Australian trees in California. So just a shout out to those people, opportunities are there if you want to come down.
Yeah, I encourage everyone to check out your work. It's really beautiful stuff, and if it catches your eye, then you know where to find him. So
awesome, thanks, Addison.
Awesome. Well, this has been a blast. I always have a lot of fun chatting. Hopefully, I'll be able to see you soon. I don't have a trip to Australia quite yet planned, but maybe it's in the near future, and then. Yeah, whenever you're over in the U.S., I would love to see you. So
I'll be back sooner than later. It'd be great to actually meet you in person one of these days. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Hugh. Really appreciate it. And thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely. Thanks, mate. Really appreciate it.